Hey guys, it's Mr. Benson, and this week we're going to talk about other mechanisms of evolution besides natural selection. So before we continue, I want to just quickly recap what evolution is. So evolution is not when individuals change, it's when populations change, and more importantly, the part of these populations that is changing is the allele frequency. So the frequency of specific traits or specific alleles either increases or decreases depending on natural pressures in the environment. So these alleles typically increase the fitness of that organism. And so fitness means that they are fitting into their environment, that they can survive for longer and have more offspring. One of the mechanisms outside of natural selection where organisms undergo evolution is artificial selection. And when human beings breed and domesticate animals or plants, they are using evolution as a tool to get traits that they want. So for instance, dogs are the classic example, right? There's tons of breeds of dogs, and some of them have very specialized jobs. Some of them have a really good sense of smell, some have a good sense of sight or hearing. Some of them are just cuddly, and they like to be lap dogs. Human beings have been breeding a species of wolf for thousands of years into these incredibly diverse jobs. And because of this, we have things like Chihuahuas and Great Danes that are still a member of this parent species. The gray wolf and a Chihuahua have a common ancestor, and they're so closely related that technically they could interbreed with each other. Dogs are a subspecies of gray wolf. Corn is a great example. Corn is a species of grass, and it has seeds. You probably have seen seeds in grasses at some point in your life, but the part that you eat are those seeds. Human beings have been breeding these grasses in Central and South America for thousands of years so that the seeds are really big and plump and juicy and edible. Same thing with strawberries. On the left here I have some wild strawberries. They're pretty little. When you go to the grocery store and buy strawberries, you're buying a strawberry that is the product of hundreds or thousands of years of selective breeding by human beings. Alright, let's talk about our next mechanism, which is genetic drift. And genetic drift is a random change in allele frequency. It happens to small populations, and it's usually due to some random event in the environment, like a wildfire, or if you're a population of beetles like these guys, somebody randomly stepping on you. So if there's only 9 individuals in your population, and 3 of them are green, and 2 of those get stepped on, then the allele frequency for green coloration has gone down by 2/3, right? So the population has changed because of some random event. This wasn't a natural selection event because the human wasn't purposefully doing this. It's not like a predator came by and ate these insects. The trait is not disadvantageous in this situation. It's just a random event. So other random events could be things like a tsunami, or a volcanic eruption, or a hurricane, or a wildfire. These are things that could affect a small part of a population, and if it's a small population to begin with, then the allele frequency has been changed by a fraction of that. So that's a pretty dramatic effect on a small population. Think about organisms that live on islands, right? They have a small population by necessity. There's not a lot of space. So they're particularly susceptible to genetic drift. One example of genetic drift is called the Bottleneck Effect. And if we could think about this literally for a second, imagine if you have a bunch of M&Ms in a bottle and you pour out a small amount of those M&Ms. You know, M&Ms come in lots of different colors, the brown, red, yellow, green, blue, stuff like that, right? If you pour out a small selection of that population and then reproduce those M&Ms, you're probably going to end up with a population that looks very different than the original. An example in real life are fur seals. So 200 years ago, fur seals had a wide variety of colors, but human hunters liked the darker colored pelts, so people would hunt these seals to make coats or clothing, things like that. Due to hunting, when you look at fur seals today, you're going to see a population that's mostly brown or white in coloration. And that's because human beings came into this population and selected against a trait that, for all intents and purposes, was random. Another example of genetic drift is the founder effect. So this is when a small group of colonizers move to a new area, and that small group might have a different genetic makeup on average than the original population. Classic example is in South Africa. So Huntington's disease is relatively rare in people, but South Africa has a group of people called Afrikaners, which came from one single boat in the Netherlands about 400 years ago. That one single boat had one individual with Huntington's disease. Over the course of 400 years or so, those genes have spread throughout that initially small population to the point where Huntington's disease is much, much more common in this population. Okay, let's talk about our next mechanism, which is gene flow. Gene flow is an easy concept to understand. It's just migration, right? So emigration or immigration will affect your population's gene pool. If we're looking at the picture here with beetles, we have a population of green beetles where there's no brown beetles there, and one of the brown beetles is moving into the population. Since they're members of the same species, they can interbreed, and so what's going to happen is the allele frequency of brown coloration is going to go up in this population. We could look at an example here of deer. Imagine a population of deer that's split in half by a mountain range. Those two populations will build up their genetic differences because they're isolated from each other. But if a mountain pass opens up somehow, maybe a rock slide or something happens, some of those deer from each population can start to move into the other. And this will change the allele frequency of that population. A classic example, another one, this is one that Darwin took note of, is something called sexual selection or non-random mating. Non-random mating is when mates decide what traits survive and not nature itself. Classic example are peacocks, right? So male peacocks have these huge, amazing, beautiful plumes of feathers that in any other prey animal would be a liability, but peacocks can fly away from predators. So they don't have to worry about that selective pressure as much. Instead, the thing that's determining what peacocks look like are female peacocks. They think that those big plumes are impressive. The more impressive you are, the more likely you are to have a mate. Any group of animals where there's sexual dimorphism, that means where males and females look different from each other. Sometimes they almost look like they're different species. Any species where there's sexual dimorphism probably has some degree of non-random mating involved. Okay, so we've talked about the mechanisms of evolution outside of natural selection. And now we're going to talk about the different speed settings that evolution has. We have gradualism and punctuated equilibrium. Gradualism is a theory put forward by Charles Darwin, and he believed that evolution happened at a slow and steady rate. We could imagine this as sort of a gradient, right, where mutations and adaptations slowly accumulate over time. The human evolutionary record is pretty complete, all things considered. A totally complete fossil record is unreasonable because not everything that dies leaves a fossil behind. But with humans, because we care about humans, we have a pretty detailed fossil record. And one of the trends that we see is our brain capacity gets larger over time, our jaw length gets smaller, and these are things that we see in the fossil record going back about 3 million years, which is pretty impressive, all things considered. But there are other groups of animals, like bats for instance, where there are big gaps in the fossil record and it's not entirely clear what's happening. In the 1970s, Stephen Jay Gould and Niall Eldridge put out this idea. So punctuated equilibrium attempts to explain these gaps in the fossil record by stating that for the most part, species stay the same for long periods of time until there's a dramatic change in the environment, which causes a rapid burst of evolution. And when I say rapid, I mean relatively rapid to how nature works. We're talking millions of years here, or hundreds of thousands of years, and not overnight. Because remember, populations change and not individuals. So that's it. I want you guys to answer these questions. You can pause the video in your notebook underneath your key terms. Once you're done, let me know, and I'll come by and give you your stamp for this week. One last thing, don't forget to push the buttons.